evening, ladies and gentlemen. You are tuned into the Joseph Benamy Show for Monday, October the 2nd, 2023. I'm your host, Joseph Benamy. Thank you so much for joining. As you can see, a couple of changes tonight. We are switching from a strictly audio podcast, even though we've had video in the background. Um, uh, that's really just been a picture of me and some graphics, etc. But tonight, we've decided we're going to launch our video and we're going to hopefully keep the video format moving forward. So it's a bit of a change. I've told you a few times over the last week or so that we have ongoing changes coming up. And this is one of them, in addition to the new website. If you haven't had a chance to check that out, josephbenamy.com. That is www.josephbenamy.com. All one word without the hyphen. Anyway, here we are. As I said, it's Monday, October the 2nd, 2023. And lots of things in the news. There always are. But tonight I want to focus primarily on the Truth and Reconciliation movement in Canada, and in particular, Truth and Reconciliation Day, which actually wasn't today. It was September the 30th, which was Saturday. And because it was on a Saturday, and because it's a federal holiday in Canada, public servants at the federal level and federally regulated industries like banks have a long weekend. And I have to tell you this, I don't know anybody, even though people are following the law. If you wanted to go to the bank today here in Canada, doesn't matter what province you belong to, you weren't allowed to. The bank was closed. You could still do the ATM stuff and that, but banks were closed, as were other federally regulated services. So even though people were following the rules, they were following the law, not a problem. But I don't know anybody who actually took the time to think about truth and reconciliation or the relationship between the government, the Crown, and First Nations Aboriginals here in Canada. It turned out that this was nothing more, to be perfectly honest with you, than just another long weekend, an October long weekend, 1 week before the official October long weekend, which is Thanksgiving weekend. Here in Canada, we mark Thanksgiving on the second Sunday in the month of October. So now, at least at the federal level, we have two more or less statutory holidays, long weekends in a row in October. And what this does is this one gave people the opportunity to have one last long weekend at the cottage. Lots of people don't do Thanksgiving weekend at the cottage in October. The weather's starting to turn a little bad in most places in Canada. Plus, people want to be home with their families. They have a Thanksgiving dinner, etc. So this is an opportunity for them to have one last weekend at the cottage. And for many people, that's exactly what it turned out to be. We're going to have more to talk about here. We have more to talk about with the Truth and Reconciliation Day. Some revelations that I think are not getting proper attention in the press. But before we do that, a couple of other items that I just thought we should go over tonight. The first is tied to inflation, Ontario's minimum wage. So on this weekend, the minimum wage in Ontario went up from $15 an hour to $16.55. $16.55, ladies and gentlemen. Automatic 6-point-something% increase in wages for people who are getting minimum wage as a result of inflation. Sounds, in theory, like not a bad idea, but when wages go up automatically tied to inflation, that actually is an inflationary policy. So, I don't think it's going to break the economy in any way, shape, or form, because we are talking, after all, about minimum wage. But there are businesses out there, particularly smaller businesses, local businesses, mom and pop grocery stores, the small ones in small towns, where people that don't actually have to get paid minimum wage in order to make a living, a small living, a modest living. It's not enough, mind you, to make a living and to support yourself in the big city like Toronto. You can't get by on $16.55 an hour in Toronto, but you can certainly get by very well in, say, I don't know, Bancroft, Ontario, perhaps Timmins, Ontario, on $16.55 an hour. But that's what people don't seem to understand is that in those communities where that's a fair, pretty good, decent hourly wage, mom and pop aren't going to hire people. So where I might have, if I was a small store owner, corner store, I might say, well, I want to hire a local high school student to come in half days and stock the shelves, clean up things like that. But I'm not going to do that anymore. And the reason I'm not going to do it anymore, perfectly frank, is because I can't afford to. Because I can't afford to pay what the government is requiring to pay in minimum wage. So I will take that responsibility on myself, and I'll just pocket the money. It's my business after all. And I'm not doing it because I'm greedy. I'm doing it because I cannot afford in this community to pay that minimum wage. Look, I've said this before. I'm not going to criticize minimum wage in principle. I think that there are very real downsides to it from an economic perspective. But if you're going to have minimum wage, and I understand the argument for it, but if you're going to have minimum wage, it should not be across the province, certainly not across the country. Different communities have different requirements for people who live in those communities in order to make ends meet. The cost of living in downtown Toronto is nowhere near the cost of living in downtown Bancroft, Ontario, or Lindsay, Ontario. Every community, particularly when you get outside of the large urban areas, has its own requirements, its own unique characteristics. The idea that we should pay minimum wage at that level in some of these communities when it's not necessary in order to make ends meet, it's absolutely ridiculous, particularly because in the larger population centers, it isn't enough to make ends meet. So, in the final analysis, it's an inflationary policy that actually doesn't do anyone any real good. I'm just saying. What else is happening? We learned today that the CRTC here in Canada, that's the Canadian regulatory body that covers radio and television, the Canadian Radio and Television Commission actually is what the acronym stands for, is requiring now for streaming podcast companies to register with the CRTC. Now, that doesn't sound like a very big thing, and on the surface, at least at first blush, it isn't. The whole idea is this is tied to Bill C-11, which is more or less a Canadian content piece of legislation that was passed earlier this year. Not a censorship piece of legislation, a Canadian content one. Of course, you might consider requiring Canadian content to be a form of censorship, but I think that there are some differences, so I'm not going to complain about censorship on this particular piece of legislation. But the idea being that if you're going to be streaming in Canada and you're going to be making money streaming in Canada, then if you're on the internet, you should be subject to the same rules and regulations that radio and television broadcasters are subject to when it comes to ensuring that you have Canadian content. I am a terribly strong, implacable opponent of compulsory Canadian content rules. And the funny thing is, people don't realize how much what they see and hear on television is actually controlled. It's not so much the content. It's not, like I hear people say, well, the Trudeau Liberals are helping to subsidize the mainstream media, therefore, mainstream media is going to be friendly to the Trudeau Liberals. I don't think that that's necessarily the case, but, well, more than that, I'm sure it's not the case. But notwithstanding that, you Canadian viewers or listeners to radio are compelled to watch or listen to content that you may not particularly like because it's Canadian content. Uh, I just don't see the need for that in this day and age. But that's what C11 is all about. So that's what these podcast streaming companies like Spotify, and there are a number of them that are going to be required now. First of all, to register, and then the next thing is going to be: are you providing a minimum amount of Canadian content, and is there a way that we could kick back some of the revenue to Canadian content providers? I would be one of them, but I don't want money from my streaming services other than what I'm getting for advertising revenue on this show. We don't need the government to intervene in order to help to provide financial support for what we're providing right now in terms of content. But that's the intent, that's the direction we're going, and it remains to be seen what damage, if any, is going to ensue in the streaming industry and in the podcast industry in particular as a result of now a more robust government approach to regulating the Canadian content of these services. That remains to be seen, and that's potentially a very big problem. Finally, before we get on to the main topic tonight, I want to talk about Truth and Reconciliation. Some very interesting revelations that people are not getting through the mainstream media for some reason, or not getting enough of through the mainstream media. Federal ministers here in Canada, apparently 2 months after the federal government, Prime Minister Trudeau, shuffled his cabinet, he let some cabinet ministers, demoted some cabinet ministers, and he promoted some other members of parliament to cabinet. Now, let me explain to you what a mandate letter is, because 2 months after the cabinet shuffle, it turns out that we've discovered that ministers have not yet received a mandate letter from the Prime Minister's office. What is a mandate letter? A mandate letter is essentially putting in writing for the minister what his or her mandate is on behalf of the government as they run their ministry. In other words, it's part of the plan. For instance, if you happen to be the defense minister, then when you become the minister, you get a letter from the prime minister basically outlining what the prime minister wants you to do to accomplish as a member of his or her government as the Minister of National Defense. Same thing in revenue. Same thing in, well, we were just talking about the CRTC. That comes under Canada Heritage. If you're the Heritage Minister, then you want to know exactly what it is that the government wants you to do, the Prime Minister wants you to do when he's hired you to be the minister of that department. So 2 months after shuffling the cabinet, the Prime Minister's office still hasn't issued mandate letters. Now, that may sound like a little bit too much inside baseball, but that's a big deal. And it's just another example of what is a growing realization that this government, it's not just that I'm opposed to the government because I don't like the direction it's going from a policy perspective, but it just in terms of general generic governance is incompetent. So that's a little piece of information. Perhaps you didn't know what a mandate letter was. What we're thinking about doing here is we're actually thinking about doing a civics program, a course online for people to get a better, more acquainted with how their government here in Canada works. Because there are a lot of people out there that don't know how it works, how the legislative process works, the relationship between the various branches of government, how our Constitution works. So I think that would be a very interesting thing. Anyway, we're talking about it. We're going to keep you posted on that. Well, we're going to come for our first break. We're going to go for our first break here, ladies and gentlemen. When we come back, we are going to talk about Truth and Reconciliation in Canada. We just had Truth and Reconciliation Day on Saturday, September the 30th. What does it mean? And where are we now with some of the issues that led us to having a Truth and Reconciliation process and eventually a Truth and Reconciliation Day. Where do we stand on some of these issues? Some very important information. You do not want to miss this, ladies and gentlemen. So stick with us. We'll be back in a couple of minutes here on The Joseph Ben-Ami Show.
Ice cream. Give me ice cream with whipped cream. Ice cream. Give me ice cream with whipped cream. Ice cream. A million flavors, let's just do it. Tie me up with ice cream. Sunny days need that cold hit. Ice cream. A million flavors, let's just do it. Tie me up with ice cream. Sunny days need that cold hit. That strawberry chocolate taste, ice cool vanilla for me. Hundreds and thousands, I need an ice cream island. Give me ice cream with whipped cream, strawberry sauce, and see my face gleam. I need a wafer on top, just ice cream full stop. So take me to the pudding shop. Ice cream, a million flavors, let's just do it. Tie me up with ice cream. Sunny days need that cold hit. Ice cream, a million flavors, let's just do it. Tie me up with ice cream. Sunny days need that cold hit. That strawberry chocolate taste.
There is just a feeling that this might be right for us, for you and me. There is just a look I think this might be right for us, for you and me. There is just a feeling that this might be right for us, for you and me. There is just a look I think this might.
And we are back. Thanks for staying with us. You're tuned into the Joseph Ben-Ami Show for Monday, October the 2nd, 2023. I'm your host, Joseph Ben-Ami. And as you can see, here I am. Totally, I know some people are going to go, this is not a face made for television. Well, we're not on television. We're streaming on the internet, which is the future, by the way. Streaming on the internet as opposed to cable television. I'm not saying cable television is going to disappear right away, but this is the direction we're going. Anyway, I heard a lot of people who were telling me, listen, we like the video format, which we dabbled in very early on when the show first started, but we weren't really settled on what we wanted the show to look like, the branding, etc. And so here we are, back into the video format. We might as well. This is not going to interfere with the audio podcast, ladies and gentlemen. You're still going to be able to get the audio podcast on almost all of the major podcast providers carry us. And of course, you can always check out our podcast library right there on the website, www.josephbenamy.com, all one word without the hyphen. And while you're there, by the way, you can also catch the latest. You can catch the broadcast, the video broadcast live from 8 till 9 p.m., Monday to Thursday. That's 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Or if you're not catching it live, the same show is going to be up. The latest show will always be up on the website in the video section, the live stream section. Okay, Truth and Reconciliation. I already said at the beginning of the show, and let me reiterate, what this weekend, it's a long weekend, here it's Monday, and federal government services were shut down today here in Canada in honor of Truth and Reconciliation Day. and federally regulated industries also were closed down. So, for instance, banks were closed, post offices were closed. And one wonders exactly what we accomplished by having this new federal holiday. I understand that the intent, of course, was certainly to draw attention to the in fairness, let's say the abuses, because there were abuses that were inflicted on First Nations by not American, but European colonists, settlers uh, in the past. I don't know how fair it is to continue to hold people responsible today, but I don't think it's a bad thing to draw attention to things that were not so nice the way we treated one another 100, 200, 300 years ago. As long as, we're keeping it reasonable. It's part of our history. We're not afraid to look at our history square in the face, figuratively speaking, and to acknowledge when we've done things that, let's face it, were bad. Things, of course, I don't think were always bad consistently the way some people portray it, but it's not a bad thing to face up to historic mistakes and to recognize them. But that's not really what's happened here with this particular holiday, and that's the point I'm making. The point I'm making here is that people treated this like a long weekend, just one more long weekend in the fall, the last chance to go and enjoy the cottage. Maybe you're going to shut it down. Typically, in the past, you'd do that on Labor Day. Labor Day weekend is a long weekend in Canada in September. Typically, you'd shut the cottage down. If you have a cottage, you'd do that on Labor Day weekend. Now, you don't have to do it Labor Day weekend. You could do it on Truth and Reconciliation weekend. Now, it was a long weekend this weekend because the day, September 30th, fell out on a weekend. So that's not going to be the case every year, obviously, but that's the way people treated it this year. And I just don't think that we accomplished anything that we intended to accomplish. And isn't that the problem? So what we've done is, again, basically we've just given a holiday to people and nobody's really marking it except for a very small number of people, perhaps some government officials, perhaps representatives of First Nations communities. But generally speaking, I don't think Canadians paused like they do, for instance, on Remembrance Day in order to remember anything. Is that a reason not to have it? I don't know. But it is the truth. That is what happened today. So, in keeping with truth and reconciliation, though, let me ask, are we telling the truth about the history that we're supposed to be remembering? And I want to circle back to something that I've talked about before on this show, and that is the whole residential school business, particularly the claims that were made worldwide about mass graves that were discovered next to residential schools or the vicinity of residential schools, and the assumption that these mass graves were actually graves of children who had been abused, murdered, etc., and were just dumped in these unmarked graves. Now, we already know, although it hasn't really been well explained, that in many of the cases, the so called unmarked graves were actually discovered, quote unquote. And I'm going to get to that. I want to qualify when I say discovered, because there's an important qualification that has to be discussed. But let's say, quote unquote, discovered actually were in cemeteries, and for whatever reason, over a long period of time, grave markers, which may have just been a wooden cross, ended up disintegrating, rotting away, etc. Lots of graveyards are like this. And that's what happened in many cases in this situation as well. But what's different, and this was the number one thing that I was talking about earlier this past summer on a past show, I'm wondering, when are we going to start excavating these graves in order to determine whether or not, in fact, they are just that, graves? And I'm not talking about anomaly, ground radar anomalies, because that's really what we discovered all along. We didn't really discover any graves. We the past ground radar machinery to detect anomalies in the soil, and they discovered a number of anomalies which could be graves. Now, I'm not talking about what's happening here in historic graveyards, historic cemeteries, where it's entirely plausible that the anomalies that have been detected are just normal graves that are no longer marked. So let's set those aside for a minute. Okay, so first of all, to be clear, any discoveries that were made were not discoveries of graves, they were discoveries of anomalies in the soil composition through the use of ground radar. So the only way that we could know whether these anomalies were graves was to excavate the site in order to see what the anomaly actually was. And a number of us, and abuse has been heaped on us for asking this simple question: when are we going to excavate some of these sites in order to determine what these anomalies actually are? Why? Because we want to know. It's not I don't want to see us get away with anyone getting away with anything, but if a crime was committed, then let's see what the crime was. Well, for the first time, ladies and gentlemen, for the first time, an excavation was conducted. It was conducted in the province of Manitoba, and the community was the Pine Creek Reservation, where a residential school was located. Now, I'm looking at the clock and I'm thinking, we're going to go for a break. In the business, we call that a teaser. I've teased you now. We're going to talk about what was discovered when they excavated the site. What was the site specifically? What led them to examining the site using ground penetrating radar? And what did they discover when they excavated this site? And what does it mean? What does it say for the whole argument about mass graves, one way or the other? So I've been calling for excavations. This site was excavated. Let's find out what exactly was going on there when we come back from our break. So stay with us, ladies and gentlemen. Much more to come on tonight's edition of the Joseph Banamy Show. Please don't go away. And we're back. You're tuned into the Joseph Benamy Show for Monday, October the 2nd, 2023. I'm your host, Joseph Benamy. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for staying with us. We have been talking about, among other things, the truth and reconciliation process here in Canada. This weekend, on Saturday, September the 30th, was Truth and Reconciliation Day here in Canada, a federal holiday. And because it fell out on a Saturday, which is a day off anyway, because it's the weekend, this the holiday ended up being observed today. So we have a long weekend here in Canada. A week before the next long weekend, which is Thanksgiving Day here in Canada, which is always the second Sunday of October. That's when Canadians observe Thanksgiving Day, and that's a long weekend as well. So we've been talking about this, and in particular, I was circling back to a question that I have asked repeatedly and quite emphatically earlier this summer on one of our shows, a previous show, and that is, what exactly is it that is the problem with these residential schools in the graves that has led us to not excavate them? There was a period when you might have said, well, this whole COVID thing sort of interfered, and you'd be right to make that observation, but not for 3 years, not for 4 years. So why haven't we been excavating these particular sites in order to determine whether or not, in fact, the mass grave sites were indeed mass grave sites, and to get to the bottom of all of the things that happened? Because we do want to know the truth. It's I'm not being masochistic or sadistic, one or the other, in saying that. I just think that a mature society, as we are here in Canada, at least we like to think we can handle the truth. And if bad things happened in the past, it's part of our history. It's not something to run away from. And I'll say this, ladies and gentlemen, it's not something to celebrate, but it's also from a perspective of you and I today, whether our ancestors were perpetrators or victims, you and I today, we're not part of that. So there's really no reason for you to feel victimized any more than there's any reason for other people to feel that they're ashamed of what happened. Shame to a certain degree, maybe, if there were bad things, but let's remember, okay, I wasn't born, you weren't born. None of us were born at the time when some of these bad things happened, allegedly bad things happened. And so we need to keep these things in perspective and stop trying to find ways to leverage bad history in order to obtain advantages of one form or another today at the expense of people who have absolutely no guilt whatsoever for what happened. That's the subject of a different show, though. We can have that discussion. The main thing right now are, what are the facts? So, as I said before the break, there now has been one excavation that has been completed. The community is the Pine Creek Indian Reservation in Manitoba. And nearby the school that was there, it's now been shut down, is a church. And the church is not being used anymore. It's abandoned. The story went that in this church, children were abused, deaths occurred, and bodies were buried in the basement of the church. That was what the allegation was. And so they brought in ground penetrating radar, and lo and behold, the ground penetrating radar did discover 14 potential graves, potential buried bodies beneath the floor in the basement of this church. 14. So let's call those anomalies. So the story was 14 bodies. The stories were true. People were talking this way. The stories were absolutely true. Look, we've discovered there were 14 bodies buried in this church. So all of the rumors, all of the allegations about torture and abuse and burying bodies was absolutely true. That was what was going around. So the local council decided to hire. I don't recall what the university was, but an archaeologist, and an archaeological team came in and they actually excavated the basement of the church. And we now know that there were no bodies there. They found no bodies whatsoever in this church. None. They did find the anomalies. They did discover in this church what was causing the ground penetrating radar to register a possible grave, a possible burial site. And these anomalies were things like a cluster of stones. In one case, it happened to be a sack full of old nails. Because what these ground penetrating radar do is they detect what we're calling an anomaly. What is an anomaly? Something that is out of the ordinary. So if you're passing over the ground and at a certain level there are stones, when the soil is more or less stone free, then that's going to show up as an anomaly. There's something there. And the mistake that has been made all along with respect to these anomalies is that there's been an assumption that these were actually buried bodies. And then once that story got out, and by the way, let's be perfectly fair about this. It wasn't really First Nations leaders who were out there drumming this story up. There were two groups that took these rumors, looked at the anomalies, jumped to a potentially massively wrong conclusion, or at a minimum, a conclusion that was not justified by any of the facts because we didn't know what the facts were yet. The two groups that did this were the left, particularly in this country, the Trudeau Liberals, and their fellow compatriots, ideological compatriots, who could not wait to tarnish the reputation of historic figures here in Canada, as has been done in different countries in the Western hemisphere, in the Western countries around the world. A historic revisionism. And there's nothing wrong with revisiting historic history to ensure that the narrative comports to the facts as we learn more about facts as time goes on. That's not really, revisionism the way I see it. Revisionism is when we just sort of say, I don't like the history, so I'm going to rewrite it the way I think it should happen or it should be narrated. And invariably, when that happens, invariably, we're told that we're bad people. Canadian society is bad. Judeo-Christian society has been historically bad. We mistreated and maltreated First Nations. And of course, yes, that did happen. But did it happen to the degree that it was portrayed? And in this case, the answer was no, at least in this particular community. So we have groups like the Prime Minister here in Canada, Justin Trudeau, who cannot wait to talk about how bad we were, how bad the right is. Although it wasn't a right wing, left wing thing at this time, but at the time in question, but still, it's always the same thing: bad, racists. So they are the ones that started the story, and it was the mainstream media that drove it. Right around the world, ladies and gentlemen, right around the world. Mass graves discovered in Canada. Well, we haven't discovered a single mass grave. What we have discovered are, as I said, anomalies in the soil structure detected by ground penetrating radar. That's a fact. What are those anomalies? We don't know, because until this particular excavation was completed, none were done. And so we don't know what's causing those anomalies. But we do know what possibly could cause them: rocks, other buried artifacts, anything that is inconsistent from the surrounding soil is going to show up as an anomaly. But we never excavated anything until this place in Manitoba. And we discovered, or they discovered, that in fact there were no graves. And they explained what every single one of the anomalies was. In one case, it was broken pottery. Now, is that going to play out everywhere else? Maybe not, but I'll make a prediction, my friends. My prediction is that if we do excavations in every case where we have discovered these anomalies, my prediction is that in most cases, and possibly every case, those anomalies will turn out to have not been bodies. The exception to that may be in places where we already know that the anomalies were being discovered in historic cemeteries nearby some of these schools, because remember, these were church properties in many cases. So people were buried in these cemeteries. And over 100 or 150 years, in many cases, the grave markers deteriorated. Not everybody had these elaborate marble headstones, you know. So, where the cemeteries have been located, and they've found anomalies in those cemeteries, it's entirely possible, maybe even likely, that those are graves. Are they mass graves? Are we talking about 30 or 40 or 100 or 200 children's bodies thrown into one pit and then buried over? Because that is the image that's conjured up when we talk about mass graves, after all. No. And in fairness to the leaders of First Nations in this country, in fairness to the leaders of these communities, they didn't push this narrative. In many cases, leaders of First Nations communities in this country, when it became apparent that they had discovered anomalies in their individual communities, in most cases, the leaders were being very circumspect about it. They were saying, yeah, let's not jump to conclusions, especially when we knew that it was a historic cemetery in the first place. It was the government in this country, primarily led by Justin Trudeau and his ideological compatriots in academia and in media, that pushed this narrative. And when it caught on, it got reported around the world. And it was a false narrative. And that's what happened, ladies and gentlemen. And are you going to correct that? I don't know. But I will say this: the story that I just related to you about the excavation in Pine Creek in Manitoba was a feature story that was compiled and broadcast by CBC here in Canada, which just goes to show you, ladies and gentlemen, the CBC can do its job. The CBC is not always in the tank for the government, particularly for the Liberals. Yes, they have a particular bias, generally, not everybody, but that's apparent everywhere, ladies and gentlemen. If you're a conservative, that's going to come out in the way that you conduct your affairs, your business. If you're in the media, it may come out that way too. Everybody has predilections, preconceived notions, some ideological tainting, if you want to use that term. But it was a CBC story. That's the point I'm making. So I think you have to give credit where it's due, because we criticize the CBC an awful lot. But in this case, the CBC actually did its job. And now what we have to wait and see is, are we going to have more excavations? And I'm all for them. Let's get to the truth. Truth and reconciliation, ladies and gentlemen. If you really are serious about that, then understand there is no reconciliation without truth. So let's make sure that we have the facts, not the assumptions, all of the facts. Let's put them in front of us so we know what happened. And then, if there's some process of reconciliation, of healing that has to occur, and with the residential schools, there is some of that for sure. I don't want to make light of it, but let's make sure that whatever we're doing is based on fact, truth, and reconciliation, ladies and gentlemen. All right, let's go for our final break. When we come back, this day in history. Don't go away. We'll be back in a couple of minutes here on the Joseph Benamy Show. And we're back. You are tuned into the Joseph Benamy Show for Monday, October the 2nd, 2023. I'm your host, Joseph Benamy. Thank you so much for staying with us. All right, we're heading into the home stretch, ladies and gentlemen. So, as usual, let's take a minute to talk about some of the events that happened in history on this day. Not a very active day in history. There are always lots of things going on, but in terms of actual big events that have registered across the ages, October 2nd, not a very big day. One thing that actually did occur today is that the German army in World War II launched its offensive against the city of Moscow after having invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941. The offensive, the invasion stalled somewhat, and the German army regrouped and then launched its offensive against Moscow on this day in 1941. An offensive that ultimately failed. The Germans never managed to occupy Moscow. They also did not occupy Leningrad. And the city that everybody knows about, Stalingrad, they did not succeed in occupying Stalingrad. Although in Leningrad was surrounded for somewhere around 900 days. That's how long the siege of Leningrad took place, but the Germans never actually conquered the city of Leningrad. And Stalingrad didn't occur until the winter of 1942-43. So that would be a year later. So that's what happened on this day in 1941. Uh, if you're a Hollywood fan, Rock Hudson died on this day. And if I'm not mistaken, I think James Dean did not die on this day. He died on September the 30th or October the 1st. I don't recall. Okay, so even though today is not October the 1st, yesterday was a tragic event, a crime. Let's be clear about this. We have to be careful about how we use our language, okay? In Las Vegas in 2017, on October the 1st, a gunman opened up on a crowd of people who were attending a music festival in Las Vegas, over 20,000 people in the crowd. He opened fire from a hotel room at the Mandalay Hotel in Las Vegas and ultimately killed 68 people. 68 people. So that was on October the 1st, 2017. And as I say, not a tragedy, ladies and gentlemen, a crime. 9/11 was not a tragedy. Can we stop using language like that? These were crimes. All right, ladies and gentlemen, not quite an hour tonight, but there are reasons why I wanted to cut it maybe about 5 minutes short. So we're going to call it an evening. I thank you very much for joining. Please check out the website, www.josephbenamy.com, all one word, without the hyphen. While you're there, check out our list of recommended reading. There are links to books. You can purchase them on Amazon. You can purchase the actual book. You can purchase the Kindle book. I do a lot of Kindle reading. It's quite interesting. Ebooks are I carry a whole library with me when I travel on my Kindle. There are other, I don't have a particular interest in promoting Kindle. It just so happens that that's the service that I use through Amazon. Anyway, check them out. If you have any suggestions on books that we ought to have in that reading list, by all means, send me an email. Use the contact form right there on the website. Check out our library of podcasts, our archive of podcasts of past shows, not just this one, but last week and the week before and last month and the month before, etc., etc. Tell your friends and neighbors about us as well, because we like to have listeners. And by the way, drop me an email or leave a comment if you're watching this on Rumble, YouTube, and don't forget to subscribe because that helps us as well. But let us know what you think about the video. Are there things that you would like to see a little bit more improvement on? I'm interested in your views because that helps to make us better. All right, ladies and gentlemen. Well, thank you again for joining in. We'll catch you again tomorrow night. In the meantime, God bless. And please do not, whatever you do, drink the Kool-Aid.